Hey everyone, this is Max at MaxCTCG. Thank you for joining me in another video. We're going to be going over Let the Duel Begin. This is where we're going to go over kind of getting into actually playing the game now that we've gone through all the different card types in the game and how they work and the roles they play. We're going to cover 3 sections here: how to win, preparing to duel, and the turn structure. So we're going to cover some of the basic ways for being able to win in a game. So there's 3 main ways. If your opponent's life points reach 0, you win. This is the most common way to win in a game. When your opponent starts with 8,000, and so do you. If your opponent's life points at 0, then you win. If your life points at 0, then you lose. You are also allowed to concede a duel when you feel like you are no longer at an advantage, which can be useful when you're playing in a tournament setting where you're playing a best 2 out of 3 and you want to make sure you don't run out of time when you're in a duel that you could win. The next one is your opponent is unable to draw a card. So if your opponent runs out of cards in their deck, then you automatically win the game. There are decks that focus on winning through deck out. It's a way in which you remove cards from your opponent's deck, so that way you have a better chance of actually winning through this method. Usually these types of decks focus on stalling out the game and trying to make it so your opponent can't play, and you just remove the cards from their deck, and when they run out, you win. These can be pretty good when you face them the first time, but usually in a situation where you'd be playing in a tournament setting, these types of decks don't really do well if that's what their main focus is, because they're pretty easily countered when you go into your game 2 and 3. And then the third option is if a card's special effect says you win the game. So in Yu-Gi-Oh, there are alternate win conditions, cards that will say, like, if you place these cards in your spell and trap zone, or if you in the example here, draw all 5 pieces of Yugioh, it's a way in which you win the game automatically through achieving this feat. Usually, again, similar to a deck out deck in the second example, these alternate win conditions aren't very interactive. They're fun for the player performing them, but they're generally not fun to play against, since usually they involve the opponent stalling out the game, and there's not a lot of interactivity. They can do pretty good in the first game as well, but tend not to do very good when you're playing in a longer setting, and especially when there's multiple games to play. So generally the way you'll be playing and trying to win is through making your opponent's life points reach 0. Right, so next we'll go for preparing to duel. There's a few steps you should generally take when you sit down to play with your opponent. We'll kind of cover these more in a tournament-based setting, but these are good to do when you're just playing for fun as well. So first thing you're going to do is greet your opponent. You'll shuffle your deck and then present your deck to your opponent. You'll both present each other's decks, and then you will cut it. Cutting is not shuffling, so you don't want to really be handling your opponent's cards too much. Cards can be very expensive. You don't want to do anything that might damage it. A cut is where you would take the deck, and then what you would do is you would just split it in half, put it to the side, and then cover it back up again. You can cut decks in 2 or 3. It's kind of up to you. If you're in a situation where you're playing virtually against your opponent, since you don't have the option to interact with their deck, you can ask them to do something like, when they say, how do you want me to cut it? You could say, cut it in half, and then take the top 3 and put them on the bottom of your deck. And the main thing you want to do, and the reason why you do this, is that there are ways when shuffling your deck and doing certain things with how to shuffle your cards to stack your deck to give you an advantage. So there's ways of shuffling to make it where certain cards might make it more towards the top. This is cheating and not allowed. There are different ways to do this. So being able to control the fact that you interacted with your opponent's deck to cut it and to make sure it has been kind of randomized. And it gives you and your opponent the ideal way to play, so that way everyone's in a fair state, hopefully. Sometimes that randomly telling your opponent to put 5 or 10 cards from the top to the bottom, it's a way of hopefully making it so both people are playing at a fair fair advantage and state in the game. Next, what you'll do is once the decks are cut, you'll then place them from your main deck. Place your main deck into the main deck zone and your extra deck in the proper zone. We're not really using an extra deck in these examples, but when you play it in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, you will have one, and you'll just place those in the zones that they go in. And next, you got to decide who goes first or second. In Yu-Gi-Oh, going first is generally ideal for most strategies. Some people generally decide to go second, and that could be an advantage to consider. But usually going first is the ideal move due to the fact that it's a lot harder for your opponent to interact with you. So when it comes to going first or second, you don't want to let your opponent go first because you're going to want to do it. So you're going to want to come up with some random option for deciding who goes first and second. So the most common one in like competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Generally is the high roll dice. You usually use 1 or 2 dice. You roll, whoever gets the higher number is the one that gets to decide if they go first or second. So other options are flipping a coin or rock, paper, scissors. I think high rolling dice is the best option. It also is pretty random. I think rock, paper, scissors can have a certain mental component to it, knowing most people choose rock or predicting what your opponent's going to do. There's a little bit more of a chance that I think you can, not have as much of a completely random option. So with dice, I think it's the easiest and the one most people use. And with a coin, you generally have to flip it in the air. It's a little bit an active movement to do, especially in a crowded setting. So most people in a tournament scene will just roll dice to see who goes first or second. Right, and then next we're going to get into the turn structures. So turn structures are really important to understand when going through the game because you'll perform this on your turn and your opponent will perform it on their turn. And when you're going through a turn, it's important to state the turn phases that you're going through. So that way you and your opponent agree when you're moving on. So no steps are missed. You don't give away unnecessary information, anything like that. So I'll name the phases here. So we have your first phase is your draw phase. Second phase is your standby phase. Third phase is your main phase 1. Fourth phase is your battle phase. Fifth phase is your main phase 2. And your sixth phase is your end phase. So what we'll do is we'll just kind of go through how they're labeled, and then I'll point out some things about them when you're playing and how to go about communicating them with your opponent. So, draw phase. The turn player draws a card at the start of the draw phase. The player going first in a duel does not draw a card. Your second is your standby phase. Some cards have effects that activate or costs you must pay in the standby phase. Section 3 is your main phase 1. This is where you prepare for battle by summoning monsters and activating spells and traps. If you don't battle, you go to the end phase. Your battle phase is section 4. This is where you can have your monsters on the field attack your opponent's monsters or life points. Battle damage is calculated in the damage step after a battle. More details on this are in the rulebook. Section 5 is main phase 2. This is where you fortify your board for your opponent's turn and the best time to set spell and trap cards. And they have section 6, the end phase. This is where you will announce the end of your turn and your opponent starts their turn. So again, one of the examples for going first or second is when you go first, you don't get to draw a card for your turn. And this wasn't always the case. This was a rule change they made, I believe, around 2012. Be wrong on the year, but they did eventually make this as a rule change due to the fact that going first was too strong. So this is a way to hopefully help your opponent that's going second be able to, kind of gain an advantage. Because initially, the only advantage to going second was that you got to attack on your first turn. For going first, you didn't. But one of the biggest advantages of going first is it's a lot harder to interact with your opponent when you go first. Or when you're going second, since your opponent, gets to play before you get to activate any cards that were on the field. Where if you're going first, you get to set up your board and your cards and your interactions, and then your opponent has to play into them. So they have done different things and made cards that you can activate on your opponent's turn to interact with them to help with this. But generally still, going first is so strong in Yu-Gi-Oh! That's what most people want to do. So then the standby phase. This can be important. It can be a window where you can play around certain cards that can only activate in main phase. It's also, some cards will state during the standby phase, do this action. Some cards have to pay cost. So this is an important phase to make sure that nothing needs to activate before moving on to the main phase. Again, your main phase is where you're really going to prepare for battle and interaction with your opponent. So you're going to perform most of your plays. on your main phase, you're going to be setting up a board to hopefully prevent your opponent from being able to beat you. You're going to prevent your interactions to be able to play with them when they're trying to break your board. And during your main phase, if you're going second, you're not really focused on building a board, you're focused more on breaking your opponents. And you won't really focus on building any interaction to prevent them from playing on the follow-up turn until your main phase 2. So your battle phase is what you're going to go into if you want to attack your opponent. It's a great way to clear monsters off the board and break their board. And then you'll perform damage calculations after each battle. Battle damage, the battle phase and battle damage and the damage step can be a little bit confusing when you get into the kind of like more complex inner workings of it all. But there's a lot of really great diagrams in my rulebook that I got from the Konami one. So either one you look at will be in a great state to kind of help you understand that a little bit further. But the most basic gist of this is that you choose which monsters you want to attack, and then you'll compare the attack of the two monsters if they're both in attack mode, or you compare the attack and defense of a monster if one's in attack and one's in defense mode. Next is main phase 2. So again, if you're only in your main phase 1, and you don't go to battle phase, you don't get a main phase 2. That's only after you battle. So you'd go straight to end phase. If you went to the battle phase, you would then go to your main phase 2, where then you could, decide if you have it normal summoned or you want to special summon more monsters. You can do that here to, build up a little bit of a defense. You could set spells and traps. Generally, it's recommended that when you play, you don't set any spells and traps that you're, waiting to use on your opponent's turn till after the main phase 1. As for example, you don't want to set a card in your spell and trap zone, and then due to you playing into your opponent's board in the main phase or the battle phase when you're attacking, your cards get destroyed. You want to kind of do all of those actions first to break their board, and then wait for the main phase 2 to set any cards that you want to have to interact with your board, because that's the most likely way that they'll be able to be safe. And once you fortify your board, you'll then go to your end phase, you'll end your turn. When you're in a duel with someone, usually what you'll do is you'll just state the phases as you go through them. So you'll draw for turn, you'll say draw phase. Your opponent's like, yep, that's fine. You'd go standby phase. Again, you would see, is there anything that anyone wants to activate? You could, again, use cards in these phases to play around different cards. And nothing, your opponent's like, yep, that's fine. You can go main phase 1. And that states you're going into that phase, and you get the chance to activate a card and start playing. It's always good just to make sure you state your phases as you go through. For example, if you draw for turn and you're like, okay, main phase 1, I'm going to summon a card. Your opponent's like, well, hold on. I want to do something during the draw phase, or my card has an effect that needs to activate during the standby phase. It's important to make sure you declare all these phases as you go through and get your opponent's understanding that they're good to move on as well, that they don't want to activate anything, because you don't want to give your opponent unnecessary information by skipping something that they might want to do. As the turn player, you will get the priority to activate a card first when it's your turn. So that's why when you're saying, okay, draw phase, standby phase, you're saying, hey, I don't have anything I want to do in the draw phase, I'm ready to move on. Then your opponent will then agree, yes, I'm also ready to move on, or no, I want to do something. You'll resolve something if there's something they want to do, and then move on to the next phase. So as the turn player, you always get the first opportunity to play a card in that phase if you have something you want to activate. And by stating the phase, you're giving that priority to your opponent. Right, so hopefully that kind of helps understand these phases and how to go about communicating them with your opponent. How to prepare for the duel before you get started, so you feel comfortable of going through that process with your opponent, and then also the different ways you can win. Even though this is a shorter section, I do think explaining this part is really important and really helpful for new players, especially before playing in a tournament. Understanding how these interactions work can make it a lot less jarring, and you'll kind of have all those little specific details down. And it's good to practice this way with your friends when you're playing for fun, just to kind of get all those little habits into place. I know these are things I didn't do and I learned when I was younger. Right. Like I said, if this was helpful, try to like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know if you have any questions. Try to get to those in the comments below. or if this was helpful, let me know. And I hope that I get to see you in the next video. In that section, we're actually going to be going over important cards. So this is an idea that is used in modern competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! There's an idea of a meta. You might have heard this in other games. It's just a way of understanding what the most effective tactic is available, and being able to understand what cards are really good, what cards are being played even between you and your friends, is a really important thing to think about when in a game. We're going to go over recognizing, what these cards are in the mock duel that we're going to be going through between Yugi and Kaiba. So that way, when you have these cards in mind, you can think about how to play around them and what cards might, be something that your opponent's playing. So that's what we're going to cover in the next series. I think it's going to be really helpful and probably one of the most important ones when it comes to building a strong foundation and moving towards modern competitive Yu. Right? Like I said, I look forward to seeing you guys in the next one, and we'll see you then.